It's a real pleasure for us to have you as guest here with us at the opening event of Fermhamente Festival. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Very excited to be able to take part in your festival.
What are, in your opinion, the top challenges for humankind in the 21st century, and how mathematics can help us to face them and to build an eco-science?
Well, that's a very, very good question. And at the moment, the top challenge is certainly COVID. And we have to work out how we're going to live with COVID and come out the other side. And that is kind of dominating everything, because COVID obviously affects not only our health, but also things like whether we can have enough food to feed ourselves. So at the moment, pretty well all of my work is looking at modeling COVID and using mathematical models to try to predict what's going to happen in the next few weeks and months. But assuming that we resolve the COVID problems, and I'm sure we will, then climate change has to be the dominant impact on human beings, certainly over the next decades and beyond. And climate change has so many impacts, it's hard to know where to start, but I would say that the primary impact it's going to have on humanity is the loss of our places where we can live, and also it will have a dominant effect on the food and whether we can produce enough food to feed ourselves. So I would say understanding the impact of climate change on humanity is absolutely crucial. And mathematics is really vital with this, because we need to be able to peer 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future using the information we have at the moment. And really the only reliable way to do that is through the use of mathematically based and validated models. So that's where mathematics is important. It means that we can kind of look into the future and take actions now that we know will then have a beneficial effect in the future, and maybe stop doing things which we know will then have a harmful effect in the future.
So your research and work is about climate models. How do they work and why they are so useful for us?
So a climate model is a kind of representation of the climate on a computer so that you can use that to make predictions into the future. And what a model does is it starts with the laws of physics. So the way the climate works is that you have the sun providing energy which heats up the air and the oceans, and then the oceans and air circulate around, and you have ice forming and vegetation and carbon dioxide and many, many other things. So you need to understand the basic physics of how all these processes interact with each other. Once you've got that, you then need a ton of data which tells you what the Earth is doing at the moment, and probably you want to see how the Earth changed in its climate over the last 100 or maybe even longer period of time. And that data informs your model. It's what we call calibrates the model. And then when you've got the data and all the physics together, you then turn that into mathematical equations. So you can write down an equation which tells you how the ocean will circulate. You can write down an equation which tells you how the atmosphere will move. You can write down an equation which says if you've got this amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's how hot things will be. So you write down all those equations, and you have to write them down for everywhere in the Earth, which is a lot. So you end up with an awful lot of equations, far too many to be solved by a human being. So you take those equations and you put them onto a big supercomputer. And then the supercomputer solves the equations, and it makes predictions from those equations of what's going to happen over the next, say, 100 years. Now, on its own, you can't just do that on its own. You have to compare certain predictions against what you see in order to be able to test your model, to make sure that you got the physics right, that you've built everything in. All models are approximations of reality. They have to be approximations in order to be able to do any sort of computation. The question is, are they reliable? So when you use a model, we never give a single prediction. You always say, well, this is the level of uncertainty that you have in your prediction. Now, some people think, well, if you're saying something and it's uncertain, you don't know what you're talking about. But in practice, that's not what you mean. You can say, well, I'm pretty sure things like this are going to happen within a certain range. So in a climate model, we might say, well, if you continue pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, at the end of the century, we'll have between a 2-degree and a 4-degree rise in the overall temperature of the Earth. So that tells you the sort of level of uncertainty that you're having. You're not saying, I don't know what's happening. You're saying the temperature is going to rise, and I know it's going to rise within a certain range. I mean, to give another example, we have models of the weather. We're pretty sure these models are right because we test them every day. But we test them against the weather. And most of the time they get the weather right, but the weather is such a complex system that sometimes things come in which simply you couldn't build in advance, and then you don't get the weather forecast right. But most of the time it gets right, and it's getting better every year as we improve the forecasting models.
You strongly believe that knowledge exchange could be an answer to problem solving. You are part of several projects, one of which is VCAMS.
Well, let me tell you what VCAMS stands for. VCAMS stands for the Virtual Forum for Knowledge Exchange in the Mathematical Sciences. So everything has obviously gone virtual since COVID came. And what knowledge exchange is a twofold process. It's looking at problems in the real world and saying, how can I use the knowledge I have to solve those problems? That's one way. The other is looking at the problems in the world and saying, how can I generate new knowledge to solve those problems? And that's where the exchange comes from. And in another way of looking at it, I'm a mathematician. When I'm doing climate work, I have to work with meteorologists and people that know much, much more about the science than I do. And so we have an exchange of knowledge between what they know about science and what I know about the mathematics. And it's that dynamic exchange where all the kind of exciting things happen. And so with COVID, we're looking at a lot of COVID problems. We have mathematicians in VCAMS working all the time with doctors and epidemiologists and with politicians to exchange knowledge and information between us as the most powerful way of trying to solve the problems that we're facing at the moment.
You are the founder and the director of Bathtubs into Science Festival. And the question is, what can a science festival do for the general public? So why is fundamental to engage people with maths and science?
Well, science affects all of us, all of our lives are currently affected by science. And this is really important at the moment. So I assume in Italy, certainly in the UK, big decisions are being made by governments under the guidance of science. So, for example, going into lockdown in the UK was based on the advice to the government of the scientists in the UK. So if people's lives are being affected by science, it is right and proper that we give them an understanding of the scientific process and how those decisions are being made, and the limitations of science as well as its benefits. We owe it to everyone who's being affected by science. And obviously COVID is what's happening at the moment, but many other things like the changing in technology, the use of algorithms all around us to make decisions, climate, of course, we've touched on, and the way, for example, mathematics might be used in behind your credit card or your bank balance. I mean, these are massively important things. So I think these are all good reasons, apart from and including the sheer joy of discovery that you get from doing science and mathematics. And no science festival should not have an element of wonder and excitement behind it.
We are at the end, Christoph. So the last question is, if you have to tell something to Fermhamente people that could be useful for their future from now on, and you can choose about 3 words that you can leave to them, what are the 3 words you suggest?
My 3 words would be lift yourself up. Lift yourself up. So often when you do science popularization, you're accused of dumbing science down to people. And I couldn't agree with that less. I think what we should be doing in the science festival is taking people and lifting them up so they can see the wonders of science and make a real difference as a result.